Hi guys, so we are beginning unit 3, the biological bases of um, behavior. So, we have the functionalists and the structuralists who are first looking at what's going on inside of the body and trying to figure it out. But problem is that you can't really observe that. At least you couldn't when psychology first started. So that gave birth to the behavioralists, who are like, we need if we're going to be empirical, we need some sort of data. And what can you observe? You can observe behavior. That is usually overt, and you can gather data on behavior and come to conclusions based off of it. But for every behavior, there is a biological processes that is happening that's causing that behavior to start. It's happening in the brain. It's been signals sent throughout the body. So everything psychological is biological, and that's what we're going to look at in this unit. Starting with the body's method of communicating, and that is through neurotransmission. There's also other ways as well, the endocrine system, but looking at the neural structure, the nervous system, and then look at the endocrine system later on. So the big system is the nervous system, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and that nervous system is made up of individual neurons. Okay, the neurons are the cells that are the building blocks of the nervous system. Three main tasks of a neuron: to receive information from other, either through a stimulus or usually through other neurons, and then carry that electronic signal on to the next neuron. So the brain itself is made up of over 100 billion neurons. So neurons are incredibly numerous. That's just in the brain. There's also, of course, countless others to the rest of the body. So very, very, very important and numerous cells in our bodies. So neurons fire. They send an electrical signal through the neuron itself. Okay, and we'll look at that process later. Come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some are very, very, very. They're all small in comparison, but some are longer than others. The ones in the legs, especially, that carry the signal for longer. There are sensory neurons, the ones that take on stimuli, external stimuli. Motor neurons that connect to your actual muscles that cause the movement or whatever to happen. Most are interneurons. So those are the ones that just connect to each other, that just kind of pass the signal down the connection until it gets to where it needs to go ultimately. So here's our neuron. We have our piece of paper that I handed out with all the different parts. So let's go over those real quick. So you have first the neuron. Most of them are interneurons, which means that they're getting the signal from another neuron. And they get that signal through the dendrites. Okay, so the branchy dendrites coming off of the soma, the cell body, I'll just put that up there, are what's receiving information from those other neurons. And then so it goes through the soma, and the soma is the part of the body of the cell. So you got your nucleus and all the other parts of the cell that you've learned about in biology class and stuff. And then through the sodium-potassium pump that we'll look at later on, a message is sent through this long part right here called the axon. Okay, so the axon is where this signal is being sent. A neural impulse is being sent along the axon. Axon is surrounded by this fatty tissue here that insulates the electrical signal, and it allows it to be sent much more efficiently, and that is the myelin sheath. Okay, so it's this fatty tissue. It insulates and helps speed along the message that is being sent down the axon. Okay, ultimately it's sent to these terminal branches that are connected with most cases other neurons. Okay, so received through dendrites, goes through the soma, the body of the cell here, down through the axon surrounded by the myelin sheath, and then finally to the terminal branches that usually connect to the dendrites of other neurons. Okay, so here's some actual images of neurons. You can see the somas here. Here are dendrites, axons, and then looks like this might be a terminal branch right here. Okay, but very, very numerous. And here's one that's even more zoomed in. So here's, you can actually see the parts of the cell, the nucleus. Okay, here's the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon here. So it sends messages down along the axon to another dendrite. Now it doesn't actually physically connect to the other soma, the other dendrites there. Okay, the other neuron. The researchers found that out, that the signals actually go much slower than they should if everything was connected. So like, hey, there has to be something else going on. And it turns out there's a small gap in between, a small little gap there called the synapse. Okay, so this would be the terminal branch of one neuron, and then this would be the dendrite of another here. Okay, so when that action potential comes down, it actually triggers the terminal branch here to release the appropriate neurotransmitters. Alright, so these neurotransmitters are stored in the terminal branch. They're released as necessary, and those then go on to the accompanying dendrites, and depending on what they need to do, will place neurotransmitters that excite the next neuron, which will then continue the chain of information being sent, or they'll inhibit, and so that's where the chain will stop. Okay, and these are receptor cells on the dendrites, so these neurons will connect to those receptor cells and then send the appropriate message depending on the neuron, and depending on the neurotransmitter, I should say. Okay, when the action potential comes down, it sends a flood of those neurotransmitters down to the receptor sites. Once all those receptor sites have been filled, all these excess neurotransmitters that aren't really needed are then absorbed back into the terminal branch through a process called reuptake. Okay, so action potential is the action. It's the purpose of the neuron. It's the sending of the message. All right, so it's the on switch of the neuron, and it always happens in the same degree. It either happens or it doesn't. There's no like the action potential can be more or less intense. It happens or it doesn't. All right, so this is when the actual electrical signal is being sent down the axon. After you have the action potential, the cell goes through kind of a recovery phase, a recharge phase called the refractory period. So during this time, no further signals can be sent. Okay, it's spent, it's done its thing. The sodium-potassium pump needs to restabilize before a further signal can be sent, before that action potential can happen again. Once it has recharged, so you have your action potential, you have your refractory period. Once everything's like, okay, we're good to go again, this is called the resting state. All right, so during this state, the cell is now capable again of sending a signal, sending another action potential, just kind of waiting for the appropriate stimuli or transmission of neurotransmitters from previous neurons before it can again fire it and continue to send the message down the way. So again, this either happens or it doesn't. Okay, all or nothing. The action potential either happens or it doesn't. There's no like kind of like it fires all the way or it doesn't. Okay, the toilet either flushes or it doesn't. You can't like half flush. Once that flushing process starts, it flushes or it doesn't. Okay, so how do we, if I put my finger very here, the sensation isn't very strong. If I push it in, my brain's like, hey, like there's a lot more sensation there. So how can we differentiate, stronger from weaker stimuli if the action potential either happens or it doesn't? Well, what happens is either, it's usually a combination, more neurons are firing. So if I'm pushing in, there's more neurons that are being activated, so that's like more signals being sent, and it happens more frequently. So the signal itself isn't stronger or weaker. It's either there are more signals being sent or they're being sent more frequently. That's how your brain understands the intensity of the stimuli that's being presented. Okay, so again, action potential, the actual action happening, the refractory period, the reload, the recharge to get ready to do it again. And then the resting potential is, all right, we're ready to go, just whenever we get the signal to do that action potential again. So the electronic part of it going down the axon happens in the neuron itself, and then you have this transmission of neurotransmitters. Okay, and there are hundreds and hundreds of neurotransmitters that have different purposes and interact in different ways. Okay, so there's lots of them. You are only responsible for a handful that we'll look at in a second. Okay, the neurotransmitters and the receptor sites basically are a lock and key. Okay, so the specific receptors are shaped to fit certain neurotransmitters, and they can't kind of go back and forth. So this is norepinephrine right here, and this is acetylcholine. Okay, so the receptor site for acetylcholine isn't going to take norepinephrine or serotonin or dopamine or what other neurotransmitter that might be there. It's only for this particular type. Okay, so they have specific shapes, and they can only bind to the appropriate neurotransmitter. Now, with that being said, there are other substances that can mimic neurotransmitters. Okay, and this is like when you take Tylenol or whatever, when you take a medication. This is basically what it does. This is how it works. So an agonist is something that mimics the action of a neurotransmitter. So if you have something that mimics, dopamine, then that will bond, even though it's not actual dopamine itself. It fits the lock-in key. It's kind of like a skeleton key, I guess, for it. And it will bind to the dopamine receptors on the dendrites of the appropriate neurons, and basically trick the neuron into believing, oh, we have dopamine there, trigger the appropriate response. The opposite is an antagonist, which blocks the neurotransmitter. So if you have an antagonist, again, of norepinephrine, then if you get the signal sent down the neuron and releases the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, it won't be able to bind the next way down because the receivers will be blocked, and they won't be able to to bind to the neuron, to the dendrites, and then send the transmission down the road. Okay, so these are the ones that you should be aware of. Hopefully, having gone through and looked at some of the other chapters and stuff, some of these you've actually seen them in action now. Okay, and how they can interact to cause behavior. All right, so, and you have your chart as well, and make sure this would be a really good thing to use something like No Cards On. Do the neurotransmitter on one side, what its known or suspected effects are, to help you study that. Okay, so low levels of serotonin, we think that leads to depression, for acetylcholine, Alzheimer's disease, dopamine high levels, schizophrenia, low levels Parkinson's. So make sure you're pretty familiar with neurotransmitters, how they work, what an agonist is, what an antagonist is. So those things that very well might be on the test. So neurons are the individuals. Next, we'll look at the nervous system, which is the system of neurons, and look at the different types of nervous system that you guys have. Take care.